I caught my wife's boss sneaking out of our bedroom, and that was just the beginning. By the time I was done, they'd lost their careers, their freedom, and even their families. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's what happens when you teach the wrong man how to destroy people legally. Rowan Hale, senior environmental systems engineer for Pacifica City, stared blankly at the screen in his downtown office. The familiar layout of filtration schematics and contamination metrics offered little comfort. His mind, usually sharp and steady, felt like it was moving through fog. Weeks of high-pressure deadlines and late nights finalizing the city's watershed protection initiative had left him with a persistent migraine, one that no amount of aspirin seemed to dull. The quiet hum of equipment around him was interrupted by the soft knock of Dave Lynn, his trusted deputy. Dave dropped off updated reports from the Clean Water Commission. Normally Rowan would have reviewed them immediately, but today he could barely keep his focus. The request for additional data from regulatory agencies felt secondary to the tightening sensation forming in his chest. Then his phone vibrated. A brief message appeared on the screen. It was from Jan, the nanny who'd helped care for Mira and Kieran ever since they were toddlers. She was a calm and reliable presence in their home. But her words unsettled him. Leona, his wife, had come home early, something she never did, and the children had reported hearing noises upstairs. Jan added that Leona had refused to let them investigate and insisted everything was fine. Rowan checked the time. Mid-afternoon, well before Leona usually left work. Her role as a senior account director at Maxwell Gray had always come first. Even when their daughter had been hospitalized, she had stayed at the office until the crisis passed. Dedication was part of her identity, or at least that's what Rowan had believed. Recently, that certainty had eroded. There were unexplained absences, misaligned timelines, receipts that didn't match stories. Always a logical excuse, dinners paid by clients, clerical errors from assistants, forgotten updates. Leona had answers for everything, just not the kind that offered peace. He replied to Jan, assured her he was on his way, and then quickly delegated the EPA communication to Dave. The words family emergency sounded sterile as he typed them, but he didn't pause. There was no time to linger. The drive home passed in fragments. Autumn leaves fell in gentle spirals along the quiet suburban streets of Sycamore Hill, the same neighborhood he and Leona had chosen for its sense of calm and safety. Their stonefront colonial, nestled at the end of a peaceful cul-de-sac, had always felt like a sanctuary. Today it felt like something else entirely. As Rowan pulled into the driveway, the front door swung open. Mira and Kieran rushed out, their small faces streaked with tears. At 7 years old, they were usually full of energy and mischief. Now they were pale and shaken. Rowan didn't need them to say anything. Their terror was written across their features. They clung to him, trembling, speaking in rushed whispers about noises, shouting, and their mother's refusal to let them check the bedroom. Leona had sent Jan away, they said. She had locked the door. She had become unrecognizable, snapping at them when they tried to go upstairs and insisting that what they heard wasn't real. One phrase stood out. She told them that good families keep special secrets. That was the moment everything shifted. Rowan's headache evaporated in an instant, replaced by cold clarity. The hints, the late returns from work, the evasive answers. It all settled into place. The story had never been about clients or campaigns. It was about deceit, layered quietly beneath the surface of their lives. He suggested the twins visit the neighbor, Mrs. Whitmore, a kind widow who had long since adopted the Hale children as honorary grandchildren. Rowan sent a discreet message asking her to keep them safe and not to allow anyone else to pick them up. Once they were safely inside, he turned to the house. The silence inside was heavy, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps as he crossed the foyer. Upstairs, movement. A door shut. The house, once a place of warmth, felt foreign, tainted by secrets. Leona appeared at the top of the stairs. Her blouse was untucked, her usually flawless appearance in disarray. She looked startled, as though she hadn't expected him to come home this early. She spoke, but Rowan barely registered the words. She gestured, moved closer, tried to explain. But the room behind her, their bedroom, was closed, locked, the handle unmoving. Behind it, muffled sounds. Something or someone moving hastily. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. Instead, he moved forward slowly, deliberately, brushing past her outstretched arm. The clarity of his purpose was complete. The time for doubt had passed. The locked door, the frightened children, the fabricated stories. It all pointed in one direction. What lay behind that door wasn't just betrayal. It was the moment that would mark the end of the life he thought he had and the beginning of something much darker and much more focused. Rowan no longer wondered whether something was wrong. He knew. The quiet that settled over Rowan Hale as he stood outside the locked bedroom wasn't calm. It was surgical. The man who had spent his career analyzing structural vulnerabilities and system collapses now faced the most personal failure of all. The breakdown of his own family. The clues had been there for weeks, like microscopic fractures in a dam. Now the breach was visible. He heard muffled scrambling behind the door. It wasn't hard to imagine what he'd find. The disheveled clothing, the unfamiliar cologne in the air, the evidence of carelessness that came only when someone believed they wouldn't be caught. The man behind that door, whoever he was, had not only crossed a boundary but had done so in the one place Rowan held sacred. His home. With precise force, Rowan struck the door just below the handle. The wood splintered under pressure, the lock giving way. The room on the other side was a monument to disrespect. Rumpled sheets, discarded garments, and a half-dressed man standing by the window fumbling with his shirt buttons. It was Julian Crest. The name struck like a second blow. CEO of Maxwell Gray. Leona's boss. A man Rowan had met several times at corporate functions, who had shaken his hand and praised his environmental work while apparently plotting something far more insidious. Crest looked stunned, but only for a moment. He straightened, attempted to gather his dignity. There were words, offers, attempts to spin the situation, perhaps even bribes, but Rowan heard none of them. The man's mouth moved, his wallet flashed open, a desperate attempt at damage control. But the sight of it, the offer of cash as if this betrayal could be priced, only deepened Rowan's resolve. Instead of answering, he reached into his pocket, removed his phone, and placed it carefully on the dresser. The camera faced the room. That was enough. Rowan left the door open, the splinters framing the threshold like a wound in the house's foundation. He didn't need threats. The truth was more powerful than anything he could say aloud. Crest's name, status, and connections wouldn't protect him from what was coming next. Downstairs, Leona stood frozen in the hallway. Mascara streaks traced paths down her cheeks, and her blouse was torn at the collar. Her eyes, usually so commanding, now brimmed with uncertainty. She had seen the camera. She knew what it meant. Rowan didn't speak. There was nothing left to clarify. He stepped past her, retrieving the twins from Mrs. Whitmore's home. Mira and Kieran ran into his arms, their small bodies clinging to him with the kind of trust that made everything else secondary. Rowan made no mention of what had happened. Not yet. But he knew this betrayal had gone deeper than he'd imagined. It wasn't just his trust that had been broken. It was theirs too. That night, once the children were asleep, he reviewed the footage from the nanny cams he had installed months ago after noticing Leona's increasingly erratic behavior. At the time, he hadn't been sure what he was looking for, just that something felt off. Now the recordings played back with terrifying clarity. Leona ushering Crest through the back door, instructing the twins to stay quiet, promising them gifts if they didn't ask questions or mention anything to their father. The implications cut deeper than the affair itself. She had manipulated their children, turned them into silent accomplices. That was a line Rowan couldn't overlook. He spent the early hours compiling digital copies of every relevant file, screenshots of expense reports, overlapping calendar entries, hotel bookings that contradicted business trips. The data formed a pattern, and patterns told stories. His phone buzzed intermittently, messages from Leona, a call from Crest, even a voicemail from Camille, Leona's sister, whose name had shown up more than once as a supposed alibi. None of them received a reply. At dawn, Rowan sat in his study, cross-referencing files with the meticulousness of a scientist documenting environmental contamination. Except this wasn't chemical pollution. It was emotional corrosion, and its source was now clearly mapped. He contacted Glenn Sutter, a divorce attorney renowned for his ruthlessness in high-asset cases. They had crossed paths before during a municipal land rights case. Glenn was not the kind of man who negotiated from emotion. He dealt in facts, leverage, and finality. Rowan didn't ask for sympathy. He requested strategy. By the time the sun was fully up, Glenn had the first steps underway: freezing joint accounts, initiating asset tracing, and preparing preliminary custody filings. The children were now a legal priority. Their emotional well-being had to be restored. Rowan already had an appointment pending with Dr. Isla Remington, a specialist in child trauma cases. Her reputation was unmatched. Everything moved quickly, efficiently, just as Rowan preferred. The man who once engineered watershed systems was now redirecting his energy into dismantling something else: the network of betrayal that had threatened his family. The moment of discovery was over. The era of reaction had ended. This was the beginning of consequence. 3 days after the confrontation at home, Rowan Hale sat in the polished, glass-walled office of Glenn Sutter. The room exuded quiet aggression: leather-bound files, dark walnut furniture, and a single quote engraved on the wall behind the desk: "In law, strategy outranks sentiment." It was exactly the atmosphere Rowan needed. The digital evidence he'd collected was already cataloged. Glenn had reviewed every file: hotel receipts, GPS data, synced messages from family cloud backups, and nanny cam footage. He found the story clear and damning. Leona's betrayal wasn't just emotional. It had financial, parental, and legal dimensions. What surprised Rowan most wasn't the extent of Leona's deceit, but how many others had knowingly enabled it. One name kept surfacing: Camille Cross, Leona's sister. Text exchanges between the two revealed a long-standing pattern of coordinated alibis. Social media posts time-stamped to coincide with business trips. Photos from yoga studios and cafes, places Rowan now knew neither of them had actually visited. Camille had crafted entire days of fiction so Leona could maintain her double life without raising suspicion at home. But the deception didn't end there. Another betrayal emerged as Glenn's team began auditing the couple's joint financial history. The family's longtime financial advisor, Tobias Kincaid, had overseen their accounts for more than a decade. A man Rowan had trusted not just with investments, but with long-term planning, the twins' education fund, and legacy assets. What Glenn's forensic accountant, Sierra Langston, discovered was staggering. Over the last 18 months, nearly $180,000 had quietly vanished from their portfolio. The money was siphoned in small increments, each one disguised as minor investment losses or withdrawn under the guise of market reallocation. On paper, it all looked legitimate until Sierra traced the transfers through a web of shell companies and offshore accounts. A disturbing connection appeared. Some of those accounts belonged to executives at Maxwell Gray, including Julian Crest. This wasn't merely an affair. It was conspiracy and financial fraud. Rowan sat in silence as Sierra laid out the structure of the operation. Tobias had created dummy LLCs to hide transactions. Money intended for family assets had been redirected into accounts Leona secretly controlled, many of which were used to fund luxury hotels, private transportation, and entertainment, some of which included Crest and, disturbingly, other men as well. Glenn tapped the folder in front of him. "We're not just looking at infidelity here. This is systematic. We have enough for a case of fiduciary abuse, financial conspiracy, and parental endangerment." Rowan gave a slow nod. Every revelation only deepened the divide between who he thought he was married to and the reality of the person Leona had become. They moved swiftly. First, they froze every joint and personal account tied to Tobias's network. Glenn submitted emergency motions to protect remaining assets, while Sierra's team prepared reports for both law enforcement and the IRS. It wasn't just about Rowan's finances anymore. Tobias had likely stolen from other clients as well. That made this federal. Meanwhile, Glenn had also begun building the custody case. The emotional manipulation of Mira and Kieran was well documented, and the nanny cam footage showed Leona coercing them into silence. Promises of toys and threats of punishment, used to prevent them from speaking up about Crest's repeated visits. This evidence formed the backbone of the psychological argument. The children had been used as shields in a web of lies. Dr. Isla Remington had already begun her evaluations. Her preliminary report confirmed what Rowan feared. Both children had developed signs of emotional suppression and misplaced guilt. Mira had internalized her mother's messages about protecting the family, while Kieran displayed heightened anxiety and vigilance, afraid that telling the truth would break what remained of their family life. Isla recommended immediate therapeutic intervention. Rowan agreed, scheduling weekly sessions for both twins and committing himself to the process fully. He wasn't just fighting to hold the household together. He was trying to rebuild their trust piece by fragile piece. While the legal machinery rolled into motion, Rowan quietly paid Tobias Kincaid a visit. The advisor's office, once seen as a symbol of stability and foresight, now reeked of tension. Tobias greeted him with forced composure, unaware of just how much had already been uncovered. Rowan said little. He didn't need to. When he placed a folder on the desk containing transaction logs, offshore statements, and internal messages linking Tobias to the Maxwell executives, the older man's face lost all color. No threats were made. Rowan simply stood and left, knowing the legal wave was already building behind him. Back home, things were quieter. Leona, now fully aware that the walls were closing in, had retreated to Camille's apartment downtown. Her messages grew frantic, swinging between pleas and accusations. Rowan didn't respond. Glenn handled all communications now. He had no interest in reconciliation, only resolution. The web of betrayal had grown larger than he'd imagined. But now, every thread was being traced back to its source. By the time the legal filings had been submitted and the financial blockades activated, the fallout began to ripple outward with unstoppable momentum. Rowan Hale had taken the time to prepare, to act deliberately, but now the storm he had summoned was reaching full strength. Julian Crest, once the polished CEO of Maxwell Gray, had gone silent after his confrontation with Rowan. But the silence did not shield him. The video recorded in Rowan's bedroom, discreetly angled, unmistakable in its content, was sent not to tabloids, but to strategic recipients. Among them, Aurora Whitfield, Crest's fiancée and the only daughter of Reginald Whitfield, one of the firm's major investors. Her reaction was swift and unambiguous. Engagement ended. The family investment portfolio, responsible for nearly half the agency's annual revenue, was immediately pulled. Reginald's official statement, citing ethical violations at the highest level of leadership, led to a full internal investigation. The agency's board moved quickly to sever Crest's contract, citing reputational harm, conflict of interest, and misuse of company funds. The firm's value nosedived in a single day of trading. By the end of the week, operations were suspended pending review. Crest, stripped of his title, fled the city under pressure from regulators and shareholders. His name became a warning sign in the corporate sector, a case study in how personal misconduct can annihilate professional standing. Camille Cross, Leona's sister, was next to feel the weight of consequence. Her role as an enabler had seemed harmless on the surface. Just a few fake yoga check-ins, staged coffee dates, and casual lies to cover her sister's movements. But Rowan's legal team had uncovered more. Camille had known not just about one affair, but several. In fact, financial records showed she'd received payments, some disguised as gifts, others as consulting fees, that directly aligned with the timing of Leona's hotel stays. The money, it turned out, came from Spencer Faulkner's trust fund, Camille's own husband. Spencer, a quiet man from an old money family, had always seemed disconnected from the social games his wife and sister-in-law played. But when he received a courier package from Rowan's legal team, filled with dates, receipts, and photographs, the truth became undeniable. Camille had used her access to funnel money to Leona through a variety of coordinated false fronts. She had crafted entire weekends of fiction to protect the ongoing affairs. Spencer's response was decisive. immediate divorce proceedings, total asset freeze, and full custody of their children. His family, already skeptical of Camille, moved to remove her name from any remaining trust distributions. Her access to the life she had built on lies was permanently severed. Meanwhile, Tobias Kincaid's downfall took on a public, federal dimension. Sierra Langston's audit had proven not only that Tobias had embezzled from Rowan and Leona's accounts, but that he had been running a broader financial fraud scheme across his client base. Shell companies, fake investment losses, misdirected dividends, all leading to personal accounts in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. Rowan's case triggered a wider investigation, and when the IRS and Federal Financial Crimes Unit arrived at Tobias's office, he had no way to protect himself. The story broke across industry headlines within hours. Top wealth manager charged in multi-million-dollar client fraud.
Client fled.
Licenses were suspended. Civil suits filed. Within weeks, Tobias found himself alone, facing years of litigation and criminal charges that would almost certainly lead to prison time. His former reputation as a financial visionary was replaced by one word: thief. Back in Sycamore Hill, Leona Locke stood on the porch of her former home, trying to unlock the door that no longer responded to her keycard. She had come to retrieve what little dignity remained, but Rowan had changed the locks that morning. The house no longer belonged to her in any way, and her children, now in therapy and slowly beginning to heal, no longer looked at her with innocent trust. When Rowan returned home from a meeting with Dr. Isla Remington, he found her still there. Her posture had shifted from arrogance to desperation. She demanded to speak, pleaded for understanding, insisted that this wasn't what it looked like. But it was. Every bank statement, every coaching instruction caught on the nanny cam, every lie spun for the twins' silence. Rowan had documented it all, and the courts had seen enough. Leona's emergency custody claim had been dismissed within days. Judge Sandra Martinez had been explicit in her ruling. Using minor children to cover up infidelity through manipulation constituted emotional endangerment. Leona's access to Mira and Kieran was reduced to supervised visitation only, twice a month, under state-approved conditions. Rowan served her the divorce papers on the porch, the legal boundaries as firm as his voice. Her financial access had been cut off, her reputation in the corporate world obliterated by Crest's disgrace, and her family, the only ones left who might have defended her, now focused on containing their own collapses. This was not revenge in the cinematic sense. There were no grand speeches or dramatic public confrontations, just cold, efficient cause and effect. The kind of precise, system-based collapse Rowan understood better than most. Each betrayal had created a fault line. Now each one had cracked wide open. 5 years had passed since the life Rowan Hale once knew came crashing down. What had started with betrayal had evolved into something far more profound, a process not only of dismantling, but of rebuilding from the wreckage with deliberate, unwavering purpose. He now stood before a crowd of scholars and policymakers at the Global Water Sustainability Forum in Geneva, accepting an award for his pioneering filtration systems. What began as a local city initiative had grown into an international standard, now used in over 30 countries. His work had prevented countless public health crises, saved entire regions from ecological damage, and, most personally, proven that clarity, once found, could become a source of strength. In the audience sat Mira and Kieran, now 12, both proudly wearing ribbons from their regional science competitions. Mira had focused her project on portable purification units for rural areas. Kieran had built a prototype for a solar-powered water regulation valve. Their journey had been long, scarred at the start by secrecy and emotional damage, but under the steady guidance of Dr. Isla Remington, they had learned to recognize manipulation for what it was and reject it. What had once been whispered pain had been transformed into personal power. Next to them sat Sierra Langston, now Sierra Hale. What began as a professional alliance forged in the fires of legal chaos had grown into something neither of them expected. They had taken their time. Rowan had made sure the twins were ready, that trust was rebuilt from the ground up. But when he and Sierra married 2 years ago, it was not a replacement of a family. It was the creation of a stronger one. They now lived in a coastal home outside Monterey. The twins had their own lab space. Sierra's career in forensic finance had only flourished. She now led an international team auditing non-profit environmental organizations. Rowan's consulting firm, Hale Systems, employed over 100 specialists and collaborated with global agencies on clean water projects. Their lives were no longer reactive. They were intentional. As for the others, the ones whose actions had nearly destroyed them, they had each faced the consequences of their choices. Julian Crest was now a footnote in business textbooks, cited in ethics modules as a cautionary example of corporate collapse triggered by personal misconduct. After losing his executive role, his investments, and his public standing, he had relocated to a small city in Nevada, working in real estate under a different surname. When federal investigators reopened inquiries into his past dealings, more fraud emerged. His upcoming trial loomed over what remained of his existence. Tobias Kincaid had not fared better. The breadth of his financial crimes extended far beyond the Hale family. His conviction resulted in a 14-year sentence without parole. By the time sentencing concluded, his former clients had filed enough civil lawsuits to ensure he'd leave prison to financial ruin. Camille Cross, once a regular fixture in high society circles, had lost everything. Her divorce had been swift, and Spencer Faulkner's family had ensured she was removed from every trust, board, and inheritance document with her name on it. Now working in a discount retail chain in the outskirts of Seattle, Camille lived alone. Her children, now teenagers, had no contact with her, a result of both court orders and their own wishes. Leona Locke, the woman who had once called herself the backbone of a powerful household, found herself living in the shadow of every lie she told. After losing custody, her supervised visits dwindled. The twins had stopped referring to her as Mom 2 years ago, choosing instead to call Sierra that title organically, an earned, not inherited role. Attempts by Leona to revive her career had repeatedly failed. Any employer who conducted a thorough background check found too much to overlook: false claims, reputation-damaging connections, and public court records of custody rulings and fraud. Desperate, she had tried to secure a business loan using forged documentation. The scheme failed. A judge, ironically the same one who presided over her divorce, sentenced her to 3 years in federal prison for attempted fraud. The ruling included restitution for misappropriated funds, as well as a court order to cease contact with the twins until cleared by a psychological review. Back in Monterey, life had taken on a different rhythm. Evenings were spent around the dinner table, where conversations shifted from science projects to weekend hikes. Rowan and Sierra were now expecting their first child together. Mira and Kieran had taken the news with joy. They had long viewed Sierra as their mother, and the idea of becoming older siblings only strengthened their bond as a family. The home, once broken by deceit, now thrived with laughter, stability, and purpose. Rowan no longer tracked the lives of those who had betrayed him. Justice had already done its work. The system he once feared would collapse had proven resilient. In his career, in his family, and in his soul, balance had returned. What had been torn apart by secrecy had been rebuilt with truth. What had been poisoned by manipulation had been filtered, cleansed. Justice, like nature, had a way of correcting itself. Rowan had simply made sure that every ripple found its proper flow.